What's up, Scyushi Squad? We are back in some more Trove. And today I thought, you know what? I haven't done a video like this before where we talk about my favorite classes in the game, which I think most of you that have been regulars with the channel are going to end up knowing the ones that I'm going to pick and choose for the top. Based on my main. But generally speaking, I do have some things to say about some of the classes, and I think that this is a very appropriate time to do so because a lot of these classes ended up getting huge reworks, which we ended up kind of skimming upon in the console update, and more specifically talked about with the Shadowy Spotlight update. So for those of you that don't know or are just coming back to Trove, the Sunrise update finally is on every version of Trove, and everybody on console is pretty much all up to date with the version that we have on PC, which means that a lot of classes ended up getting changed and are a lot more viable now, because I still see some of you guys in the comments like asking, oh, can I play this class? Can I play this class? Well, yeah, you kind of can play any class that you want in this game, save for a few. Now, I will admit that I don't necessarily have like a tier list or anything. I'll probably have like a Trove class tier list at another point in time, because that is going to end up being something that is much more critical in talking about where I think these classes fit in the spectrum of, oh, this class sucks, this class is great, so on and so forth. Today's video is specifically focusing on my favorites. So this is just going to end up being my own personal opinions. And when we end up getting through this, well, I mean, you guys can end up sharing your own personal opinions of which is your favorite classes as well. But before we get started, let's have a quick break to talk about today's sponsor, Gamigo. Have you ever wanted to have like tons of money by cosplaying a bunch of cool characters? I'm not talking about some Marvel contest or anything. Instead, we're talking about the Trove cosplay contest that is going on TikTok right now. So I'll put a link in the description to where you guys can end up seeing more details about the contest. But generally speaking, here's what you're going to do. You're going to end up checking the link in the description. There is going to end up being a video tutorial of how you end up crafting this mask, which I did incorrectly. It is also going to end up being in color. I don't have a colored printer, but you are going to craft this mask and then record yourself out in public somewhere for a video on TikTok, and then you're going to end up using the hashtags of hashtag Trove cosplay, hashtag gaming, and hashtag cosplay in order to end up qualifying to enter the competition. Obviously, there is a bunch of rules and so on and so forth, but generally speaking, you're going to have your entry on TikTok before August 28th in order to end up being a participant. Now, just by being in the contest, you're going to end up getting a Sundered cash in game, which is already awesome. But then 2 lucky winners. The first winner is going to end up being chosen by the video that has the most likes. They're going to end up winning 1,000 euros. And then second place is going to be chosen by a jury of judges, which is going to end up being Gamigo employees and myself. That second place winner is also going to end up winning 1,000 euros. So what are you waiting for? I don't care if you don't even play Trove. Go and be a part of this contest, dude. Come on, do it. Another thing I do want to mention is that if you guys do end up putting your TikToks up, there is a likely chance that you may or may not show up in one of my videos down the line, because I do want to end up doing a TikTok reaction video to the Trove cosplays, so that I could probably end up finding some funny ones. And I also want to end up entering the contest myself. I have some ideas that I've come up with. I just haven't actually like done them yet. Anyways, again, I want to say a big thank you and shout out to Gamigo for the sponsorship on this contest. That's actually awesome that they reached out to me. All right, so let's start with the worst of the worst. The classes that I just generally speaking don't really like. Right at the bottom, I'm sorry, Fae mains, but I don't like the Fae Trickster. I've never enjoyed the class. I remember way back in the day when I first was leveling up the class, I found that it was the only class that I had, I don't know, that I just really didn't like the grind. Like, I found it to be really boring, and I just knew like, oh no, I have to get this class to level 30 now, or back in the day max level was 20, and it was just, I don't know, there's just something about this guy that I just don't really like. I think most of all it's just got to do with the artistic style of the character. Like, I'm not the biggest fan of like fairies and all of that mythological stuff. Like, I prefer more brutish like creatures, or like, you know, shadow demon characters or whatever. I don't know, or like very physical stuff rather than magic based, which is more to my character, not necessarily in reference to Trove. But that's why Fae Trickster is kind of just at the bottom of my list. The next one is going to end up being a bit of a tough one for me, because I want to say Gunslinger, but it's not that I inherently dislike the Gunslinger. I just think that the class really needs a rework right now, and I'm not talking about its damage numbers need buffed. I'm talking about the class itself and all of its abilities feel dated and boring, and that's the reason why Gunslinger is so low on my list. But otherwise, I generally do think that the class is fine, and I don't think that it needs to have any reworks into its style, because I actually really like the whole idea of, oh, it's a Gunslinger, you know, pew pew craziness. I just think that they need to kind of overhaul its abilities to end up making it something more functional, more cool, and something that is going to end up just, I don't know, generally being awesome. Now, speaking of, we've kind of got another character that fits into that category, the Knight, which, whoopsie daisy. Let me just pick some basic style because who cares? Or there we go, fish head. So the Knight is another one of those characters that I really think needs a rework, and that's why I dislike it so much. But the irony is that I don't necessarily... Like, the Knight is one of those classes that I think its abilities really need to be recalculated and recalibrated, because as of right now, the most powerful version of the Knight is literally just based off of its base attack, and all of its other abilities are superfluous. They're just an absolute waste of time, including the class gem ability is actually weaker than the base attack of the class right now, and so there's just no point in even bothering with the input of the button to use all of its other abilities versus just whack, 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 right? Now, on top of that, the thing that I detest the most about the Knight is its style. You know, we've got some really cool costumes for the character, don't get me wrong. It's most of all just the class feels extremely dated, you know, like its style. I always relate to a teapot because that's kind of just what he looks like if I end up choosing one of the base costumes, you know. He just looks blocky, right? And that's because that's what the character looked like really early on in the game. You know, this is the same Knight that we've had in the game ever since I started playing, and it was the first class that was ever added. Now, that said, I'm sure it's gone through some renditions from the very first iteration of the character, but I would like to see them kind of overhaul it, make him a little taller, make him more knightly, and just completely rework the character from the ground up. You know, even if we end up it would end up having to have these costumes all redone for the new Knight body. I just think that that would be really cool, and maybe then I would ever end up actually maining the character. Now, I'm noticing a theme. A lot of the classes that I'm picking for the lower tier of the list are going to end up being the older classes, which Pirate Captain is going to end up being another one of those as well. Pirate Captain is cool, don't get me wrong, but it's just a class that I could never really get behind. It can end up being quite powerful, but a lot of this character, I think the expectation versus the actual in-game execution was a bit of a letdown, because when the rumors were starting and talking about the Pirate Captain years and years ago, a lot of us were under the impression that it was going to end up being the first ever melee / ranged character all at once, to the point where we were assuming the left click or base attack, he was going to end up cutting and slicing with a scimitar, and then the right click would have actually been the shotgun blast, which I think, you know, functionality wise, it just would have been a lot cooler. I don't know if there would end up being any particular reason for that, but instead what we ended up getting was a technical character that ends up throwing down a bunch of units and so on and so forth, which, you know, it feels like a toy maker to me, right? And that's why we've actually got some costumes that represent that, where, you know, they have the Pirate Captain as a toy maker. Now, that said, that's not my style of fun. Like, I'm not the biggest fan of the classes that end up using their minions to end up dealing damage, save for Tomb Raider, which we'll talk about later. Just in games in general, I feel like unless your minions kind of follow you around and stuff, like, it's funny how I really enjoy units that carry on with you and fight alongside you, but having a static turret on the ground, now suddenly I'm just unsubbed from it. Like, I don't know why, but I just don't like it. Speaking of classes being a little bit too technical, you guys are going to end up being quite surprised by this, especially this early in the list, the Bard. So I want to be clear. I really like the idea that we have a meme class in the game. I really enjoyed my time with the Bard when it was first added to the game as well, but you will notice that it is probably one of the newer characters that I moved on from the quickest, and the reason for that is simply put because of its gameplay. So the way that the Bard works, if you don't know, is you're basically going to end up having all of your abilities revolve around your ultimate, which is these songs, where it's going to have an icon that you have to end up replicating the movement of it, either down on the hotbar or on top of our character. And by doing so, we end up building up our ultimate ability so that we can end up getting different songs to end up playing. And then we can use that to end up giving ourselves different buffs. It's a very technical character, and a lot of this character's functionality to me is the polar opposite reason why I enjoy Trove in the first place, because I don't want to be looking at menus as if I'm playing like some DDR step mania thing and trying to use these very specific abilities rather than just go out and do damage, right? Now that said, I think that that works perfectly with this type of character. I think that they nailed how the Bard functions, and I know just from experience in like other games and so on and so forth that the weird technical, the weird technicality of this character is something that certain people do enjoy. It's just, for me personally, I'm not a big fan of this particular gameplay style because I just rather Unga Bunga go in and hit things. Speaking of Unga Bunga hit things, yeah, the Boomeranger. Yeah, you thought I was gonna end up talking about the Candy Barb? No, the Boomeranger. The Boomeranger. Boomeranger is one of those weirder characters. Why don't I have a weapon on him? Oh well. I feel like Boomeranger just never really came into its own in terms of how the class operates with its like functionality more so than its style. Or, well, even the style I would criticize because it's kind of a jack of all trades, master of none. Because if you'll notice, this class has a lot of Nintendo references and generally speaking is going to end up being a Link from Zelda ripoff character. But he's got like the Mario jump, he's got the big bombs and so on and so forth, right? So lots and lots of references to Nintendo games, which is why I appreciate what this class is setting out to do. Now that said, I don't know, I never really found his abilities to be particularly fun to use. They're very quick and very gratifying, don't get me wrong. Like, this class is fun despite the fact that I'm contradicting myself. It's more so that I've got years and years of experience with this character being broken, and not in a good way, that I don't know. This class leaves a bad taste in my mouth because when you use your ult, if your bombs go off, those will end up knocking enemies away and off of dungeons. There's too much knockback on it, and so I never end up using that ability. The Bach bomb minions used to actually be really, really powerful way when the Mantle of Power update was first added to the game, and then they nerfed it into the ground, and thus the character basically was trash up until the Shadowy Spotlight update more recently, where they ended up reworking the character and buffing it. Now, that said, I personally think that the Boomer needs a little bit more of a buff, although I know that there are some of you that would argue otherwise, because the strongest version of the Boomeranger is actually with the bow and arrow. Now, for me personally, I enjoy this character with the melee weapon, and that's probably why I feel this character suffers a little bit, because the way that it operates right now is you're going to end up using the hidden ring effect, you know, the chicken bird feather explosion one, with your bow and arrow, and then that actually ends up doing heaps and heaps of damage for the Boomer, but generally speaking, to me, just feels like a less fun Shadow Hunter. We're already kind of getting into the home stretch. It's really interesting to look and see like which classes end up falling into which category for me, but I think next is probably just going to end up being the Revenant, man. Even though I absolutely love this stupid costume, generally speaking, I remember when the Rev first came out, I don't know, there was just something about him where he's a badass, but I just couldn't get behind him. I don't know, dude. Like, it's just maybe just the style of the costumes or something like that, or maybe it's just its attacks in general, because a lot of it was to do with this whole right click shield bash and then its base attack and then the spirit spears and stuff. And don't get me wrong, it's all really, really cool and looks really, really flashy, but as far as the gameplay style of the character, I just couldn't really get behind it 100% like I did with some of the others back in the day. Now, that said, we've had a lot of iterations of the Revenant in terms of reworks and its abilities working better. The life steal was not in the game for the Revenant early on when it first got into the game, which now it's basically invincible, on top of the fact that it deals heaps of damage. But even now in its current state, I'd say that the Revenant's functionality is a little bit boring or a little bit jarring, because the right click is basically useless, and your most efficient way of dealing damage is just toggling on your number one and then using your base attack in combination, which is cool, but again, for me personally, not my favorite. So many choices, so little time. I'm kind of drawing a blank here, dude, with the next classes. This is getting really difficult for me to pick. You know what? I guess I would say Neon Ninja. Oh boy, I know that's gonna hurt some people. So Neon Ninja is one of those characters where I love how powerful the class is, and its functionality I feel is perfect. You know, like it's really, really like a ninja. Like he's super quick, super efficient. Even his walk animation and stuff, he kind of does the Naruto run and everything. Sorry that I don't have a weapon on him, but that's not what today's video highlight is about. But that said, I know that at the end game, a lot of its functionality wasn't as useful as it could have been. You know, like its dash ability and then its ultimate and stuff wasn't very useful. Of course, now with the Shadowy Spotlight, all of the other abilities that were lacking have been brought up a few levels. But the one reason why Neon Ninja isn't higher on the list is because of its gameplay having you face backwards 90% of the time. Because the way that you end up using this character for speed farming is backpedaling. So every time you end up doing the right click, your character will end up moving slightly backwards, but on top of that, you'll go invisible and get increased movement speed. And so you combine moving backwards in parallel with right clicking constantly to end up traveling over long distances very, very quickly. Now, another little quick tip, if you guys don't know, is if you're doing this on the ground, you will actually regenerate your energy quick enough, so long as you have an energy regen item on your character. And you can actually just spam right click on the ground, because when you're in the air or jumping, you actually will not generate more energy. But that's going to end up being the main reason why Neon Ninja isn't higher on the list, is strictly because I don't like facing backwards when I'm playing this game, which is why Vanguard is going to be slightly higher on my list than the Neon Ninja, because the Vanguard to me is a slower Neon Ninja for sure, but I like the idea that I can face where I'm going and that I can just go and punch things head on. Like Vanguard, I feel, is actually one of the smoothest characters that they've added to the game. A lot of its abilities all have very, very quick animation cycles versus, you know, something like the Solarion's right click where it's just absolute trash. And because of the animation cycles being so quick to put out, it means that the character to me is a lot of fun, because generally speaking, what I enjoy the most in terms of a combat style in a video game is when you can cut off your animations for defensive purposes or for offensive purposes. So the fact that we can, you know, dash at any point to end up interrupting our attacks. Now, obviously that's not going to end up being that big of a deal with a game like Trove. Frankly speaking, I think that we could end up very easily having a class in the game where the right click would be a block that would end up negating damage, and instead you could end up just bashing out your left click to attack, and then just right click would interrupt that attack window so that you could block at any time. Now suddenly the combat becomes more skill based rather than something that is about proper timing, which I'm not very good at proper timing, which is probably why I like those faster paced movements, and why I still love Trove today, is just because the movement style of this game is really, really fun. Now, that said, with the Vanguard, unfortunately, range mode kind of sucks. There's not really any reason to end up using it. They did end up buffing it recently with the Shadowy Spotlight update, but again, I just don't really feel any need to use it over just melee mode, because there's a problem with Trove's ranged combat in the game where the projectile has to actually calculate where the projectile is and where the enemy is at the time that you end up shooting it, and that's going to end up being based off of the server delay. And so you'll notice a lot of times you'll be shooting an enemy, but as far as the server is concerned, it says no, you're not. And melee characters completely negate this, because what we're actually having happen here is the game isn't having to calculate where your melee attack is per se, because it's basically just a cone of damage that ends up going out in front of you during a certain cycle, which is why you can very easily see, you know, something like the Draco and its fire going out. It's just a constant barrage of damage. Or even why the Pirate Captain, though it's a ranged character, technically it's still under the same parameter of a melee damage character, where it's doing a shotgun blast in front of it. So any anything that's within that cone ends up taking damage, and it's a lot easier for the server to calculate that versus a lot of the ranged characters, including your boy Vanguard right here, that shoots out a very specific small projectile that has a lot more room for error. So I guess the next one would actually be Ice Age. Yeah, I'm happy with that. Ice Age is kind of one of those characters where it's never been my particular favorite, but this I feel is a mage character done right. So whereas a class like the Knight, I feel doesn't really represent what a Knight should be in a video game, I feel like the Ice Age is the perfect wizard, right? Like there's just something about the functionality of the character and all of its abilities that all end up culminating into this monstrous character that ends up just having all of these crazy abilities that all end up complementing each other very, very well, and feels very, very like RPG heavy. Like I think that's why I appreciate the Ice Age so much. And frankly speaking, now that I think about it, why hasn't anybody made like a generic wizard costume for this guy? I would love to see that, where he's just in robes and he's got like a wizard hat, you know, like I could totally see it. But anyways, there's not really that much else to say on the Ice Age for me personally, other than just that. I guess next would probably end up being Dino Tamer, honestly speaking. I really like the Dino Tamer. The only gripe that I have with the character, even with the Shadowy Spotlight, I really wish they would have reworked this character a bit better, because your Dino Babies are just useless. It's unfortunately, the Dino Babies have always been at this point where it's not worth the time that it takes for your character to animate, pressing the button down, throwing down the Dino Egg, and the egg spawning before it ends up dealing damage. It's just not worth doing that instead of just holding left click or like tapping right click to throw down a net, right? Now, that said, the reason why I enjoy this character so much is because it has always been a phenomenal speed farmer. And as far as a ranged character is concerned, because we're pumping out our shots so quickly, and because our right click is basically just a huge area of effect on the ground that also will end up snaring the enemies, allowing your base attacks to hit the opponent easier, because as we mentioned before with the Vanguard, the server trying to calculate range damage usually ends up becoming a problem. So now suddenly when we can just ensnare those enemies, it becomes a lot easier for the game to calculate. However, again, the problem is going to end up being the babies. Not to mention, there was once upon a time, here's a little Trove trivia for you guys. So you know how you can't glide when you're using your ultimate ability? Well, the funny thing is that years and years and years ago, back when Tryon Worlds still owned Trove, before they went bankrupt and Gamigo took over, you know, there's a huge history there. I still distinctly remember when the developers ended up doing a live stream where they were showing off an animation that they were working on for a glide animation with your ultimate, where your character was gliding and you were basically holding your dinosaurs, keeping it from falling, which obviously, you know, when you're at the end game with the Dino Tamer, gliding in your ultimate is not going to end up being too much of a saving grace, because of course you're not nearly as fast when you're gliding versus when you're actually just on the ground or just running, because of the way that your movement speed works. I guess he's getting screenshots. But that said, I would still end up appreciating if something like that was actually in the game. So then what's our next option going to end up being? It's the Lunar Lancer. Whoa, this list is getting weird, isn't it? Lunar Lancer, I'll admit, the reason why Lunar Lancer is so high up on the list is because of the rework. I've always really enjoyed the Lunar Lancer. Don't get me wrong. I specifically remember here. Let me show you this in Team Pixel 5. This will be a nostalgia trip for some of you guys. So when the Lunar Lancer was originally added to the game, I was so stoked on the grappling hook ability that I ended up not only making a huge like city so that we could end up grappling around, but I was also modding at the time, and I ended up making a Spider-Man costume. So obviously, you know, looking at the build, it's actually very, very simple and so on and so forth, but I still have very, very fond memories of just how fun it was to navigate all of this with the Lunar Lancer. You know, like I've got all of these nooks and crannies and everything set up to the point where we can just end up exploring it all with 2 jump. And I don't know, it was just like a combination of Spider-Man and Mirror's Edge and stuff, and I really, really enjoyed the movement of this character. Always have, always will. And I'm really, really happy that the rework of the character ends up utilizing those movement abilities so well. Now, I know that there are a lot of lunar mains from, you know, the old Lunar Lancer that actually heavily criticized the rework to the class. But generally speaking, I feel like they made the class a lot more accessible and generally speaking a lot more fun. Its abilities are also going to end up having a lot more function to it, the way that the grapple works and more instantaneously pulls you up rather than having to throw your spear and so on and so forth. The ultimate ability is really, really cool, but honestly, the ult is kind of lacking right now. It's not really, I barely ever end up using it because unfortunately, so many of the abilities of the Lunar Lancer's ult will actually lock you into an animation. Like there's that front flip ability and you're basically stuck in that front flip until the animation finishes, which is really annoying. But anyways, so yeah, then there's going to end up being Chloromancer, I suppose, right? Oh God, my Chloromancer looks gross right now. Ugh. So Chloromancer, Chloromancer. The only reason this class is so high on the list is because the style. I think that this character always just looked awesome. And I was actually very disappointed with the first iterations of the Chloromancer. Like, you know, there was a time where it just wasn't a very good class. Like, there's just something about it. But I think that a lot of us, I think that a lot of you guys can agree. Maybe I'm wrong about this. But the style of the character and the way that costumes look and the animations of it all, like, it just looks great, right? Now, I do, even though I mentioned that I don't like having a static object for like something like the pirate captain's turrets and so on and so forth, I do actually like how the plants work with the Chloromancer. But the irony is that I know that the Chloromancer is a lot stronger now than it was when I first played the character. However, I actually enjoyed the gameplay of the OG Chloromancer better than the new one. I still prefer when my right click was my spin plant and when I could cast them a lot more often. Now that said, there was always a problem back in the day where if you had two of these down, only one of them was dealing damage. And I personally feel like they could have very easily just changed that value so that they would do stacking damage, and then it already would have brought the Chloromancer so much higher, on top of the fact that the right click is now this machine gun rather than the exploding plant, and then the ultimate is just a very weird ability where it just ends up making all of your plants bigger. Now, speaking of the theories that people had when they first teased this character, oh, you wouldn't believe it, dude. The conceptual idea that players had of what the Chloromancer was going to be and what its abilities were going to be, in my opinion, are way, way cooler than the actual in-game application. Because a lot of us were thinking that the ultimate was going to end up being something very similar to the Draco, where we would end up transforming into a giant Venus flytrap or something. And then, you know, your left click would be like your tendrils slashing about, and then your right click could be like a big chomp bite that would maybe snare enemies or something. It just, I wish that was the Chloromancer instead of now where its ultimate is basically just, like, it's just, the ult has always kind of sucked with Chloro, and it still does now. And I'm not talking about its damage probability, I'm talking about like the look and coolness of it. Now, I think that we're getting so high on the list, you guys are probably going to be quite surprised with the few classes we have left, and the fact that I'm going to say Solarion is going to end up being the next one. That's right, Solarion doesn't top some of my absolute favorites, but Solarion is very, very high on the list. And I think that a lot of that has to do with just the functionality, the fact that the class is new, obviously, is very exciting, but also just the way that everything works with it. I feel like this is what the Vanguard's ranged mode should have been. Which is weird to say, because at the end of the day, I'm not really the biggest fan of the Solarion in terms of, oh, this is the newest class in the game, this is awesome. Like, I don't really think that this class is particularly cool, but it's just got such heaps and heaps of damage, and the way that it does damage over a large area, very similar to the Dino Tamer's net being thrown on the ground, and being able to have 3 stacks of this, the shotgun blast, and all the technical little nuances with the character make it something that I highly appreciate being in this game, and that's why I have it higher on the list, even if the style of it right now is not my favorite. I think that a lot of that is going to end up being fixed when we end up having cooler costumes added to the game. However, the one criticism that I do have about this character, and I actually told the developers about this and they haven't done anything about it, is the right click ability. I hate it, dude. It's so bad because it's basically the right click ability that used to be on the Shadow Hunter, just repurposed for the Solarion, and I hate it. It's terrible because it has a very long animation window. So what I'm going to do to show you guys this is I'm going to tap right click and then immediately hold left click. And you're going to end up looking and seeing just how long it takes before we go back into our default attack animation. Right click, holding left click, there. I know that that might seem a little bit picky. Right click, hold left click, there. But I really, again, find it annoying that we have to wait out the entire animation rather than just cutting off the animation. Like, I feel like the travel time of the arrow, we should wait for that, but we shouldn't have to wait for the character to go, all right, I'm ready for combat again. You know, it's almost like it does a Matrix slow-mo effect in the middle of the combo, and that's why I never end up using the right click, despite the fact that you can actually kind of just spam the right click so long as you have the cooldown with it. Like, it's just, I don't know, maybe it's because it used to be on Shadow Hunter. Maybe that's why I hate that ability so much, but I still personally would like to see that changed. Well, now we're moving on to the last few classes, gamers, and I gotta give it to ya boy Draco. Draco has always been one of my favorite classes in the game, and personally speaking, I would have probably mained this character for a lot longer and maybe even mained it now if it had more movement speed capabilities, because I really enjoy using this character to do heaps and heaps of damage. I don't like the right click. I barely ever end up using that because that just feels extremely dated. But I really do like the reworks that we got to the class. It just does heaps of damage while also having lots and lots of survivability. And I mean, it's a dragon, dude. Like, how cool is that? The fact that we have all these little minions and fire all over the place. The class gym ability is insane now. And I don't know, there's just a lot of nostalgia to it as well, because for those of you that don't know, I've been playing this game for a very, very long time. And back in the day, U6 was actually the highest difficulty Uber world that there was. And when that was a thing, Draco was my main. And it was actually one of the stronger classes in the game, which obviously has slowly changed over time. Draco is still a powerhouse of a class. But again, the movement speed capabilities of it is pretty useless, save for if you dip your toe in lava. Then it's going to end up being a pretty fast character, but even then, that's not enough to save the class for me. I personally would like it if there was a way to activate our burnt feet fast movement speed. Like, if there was a way that we could activate that without having to dip our toes in lava, because that's very, specific parameters to happen. It just, I don't know, maybe I would end up maining the character more. But again, the shortcoming is only just that and the right click of the character. And it's those very, very small details that make the Tomb Raiser slightly higher on the list for me. Now, the Tomb Raiser, obviously, one of my favorite classes in video games is the Necromancer in Diablo 2. So the way that that character ended up working was it was a unit character. So as you're killing enemies, you end up raising them from the dead as skeletons. And so when the Tomb Raiser came out, I just was blown away. I absolutely loved the character. The only thing that I didn't like about how Trove handled a summoner class was the fact that your minions die. Now, I understand the reasoning behind this, but I personally still think it would be a lot cooler if we didn't have to deal with the whole dumb healing mechanic, and instead the units would just have a health bar and could be killed. But that said, the reason why it's higher on my list is because of not only that nostalgia factor relating back to Diablo 2, but also just because the functionality of every single one of these abilities is going to end up actually complementing itself extremely well. Like, this is a very well designed class, and the funny thing is that despite the fact that we've gotten some slight reworks with the Tomb Raiser over time, the main conceptual version of the class has remained moderately unchanged, because that's how well designed this guy was. Like, all of the abilities are basically the exact same, save for slight tweaks in the functionality, right? And that's something that I can end up appreciating. An awesome class is an awesome class no matter when it ends up coming out. And although Tomb Raiser right now is a little bit lacking, You know, Draco, I'd say, probably got a little bit too much of a buff with the Shadowy Spotlight update versus Tomb Raiser, who got a nerf for whatever reason. But Tomb Raiser still remains to be one of my all-time favorites and my go-to if I ever wanted to end up playing as a tank. Now, here's the crazy thing. I know that you guys are probably already yelling at me in the comments or just yelling at your TV screens or whatever, or your phones. Hey man, you forgot about a class. You forgot about a class. Here's the thing. I didn't forget about this class. It's just that the Candy Barb is that high on my list. Yeah, you didn't think so, right? I'd barely ever end up talking about the Candy Barb, but Candy Barb, not in this costume, obviously. Candy Barb has always been one of my favorite classes in the game. I know that that's odd because I've never really mained the character or anything, right? But he's a big bruiser, man. Like, the way that he attacks and everything, all of his abilities, it's just really, really cool, really badass, really powerful. And honestly, if you guys haven't already checked it out, since the Shadowy Spotlight update, Candy Barb is a monster of a class. It's actually dealing heaps and heaps of damage right now. You should check out my 36K video talking about the Candy Barb. I'm waiting for an excuse to swap all of my gems off of my main and to start maining Candy Barb for a little bit, because frankly speaking, I really enjoy its functionality. Blah. The only things that I feel are lacking on the character is its #1 ability with the class gem ability. Kind of suffers from the same thing that the Lunar Lancer's front flip does, where we have to wait for the animation and we can't actually control our character while we're in midair. We can't change our direction in any way, shape, or form, which sucks because the only real reason that you end up using a class gem is for this, so that you can hold your #1 and use the vacuum and pull all of the enemies towards you, right? This jump and slam down, not so much, not a good thing, because the funny thing is that despite the fact that we have no control of ourselves when we're up in the air, you can still get knocked back while you're up in the air. And so you just leave yourself vulnerable to attack. So frankly speaking, I would probably recommend using the Candy Barb without its class gem ability if you're using it as a main, because then we could actually just spam it to traverse. It's actually a really good traversal ability. However, it does suffer again from the exact same problems that the Lancer does, where we cannot cut off the animation. We have to wait for the jump in order to end up gaining control over our character again. So you have to be very careful with when and where and how you end up jumping with the character. And then the ultimate, I mean, that's just Chongo damage. It's not my favorite ultimate in the game or anything, but it's really, really powerful, and high damage numbers makes my brain go burr. And of course, I think it's no surprise that my all-time favorite character in the game, ever since it was added to the game, has been and will always be, unless we get like a really badass two-handed sword character or a samurai character or something. Trove, make it happen. We got a Neo Ninja. I know Candy Barb has samurai costumes, but give me a proper samurai that uses kendo style like Ghost of Tsushima or something. I would love that. That would probably be my only contender for the Shadow Hunter. Obviously, you know, I've always loved this character, which I find strange because in most games that I play, I actually don't like bow users. It's very odd. Like when I think to Diablo 3, for example, the Demon Hunter, which is arguably very, very similar to the Shadow Hunter. I know that they're completely different games, but those of you that have played both games would be like, oh yeah, I can see it, right? The funny thing is that I don't really like the Demon Hunter in Diablo, but I love me the Shadow Hunter. And I think it's just because the style of the character, as well as its abilities, just sync up perfectly. You know, one of the things that I also feel really adds to the Shadow Hunter and makes it the highest class on my list is you have to work at it. It's one of the only classes in the game that is arguably, or at least was arguably, useless without its class gem ability. And then that journey of suffering through leveling up and fighting enemies and stuff while you're, you know, basically garbage, and then getting the class gem ability, and then it's just a big breath of fresh air, and it's just the coolest class gem ability in the game that changes your main fire into a machine gun blast like Legolas. That alone is already enough to completely sell me on the character. That said, I still loved this class even when class gems weren't added to the game. There's just, again, there's something about it. I always enjoyed this character. I always, enjoyed playing with it, and it was my main for the longest time. And then when the class gem was added to the game, I just felt ecstatic because suddenly it was like, oh my God, my main is actually strong. And then unfortunately at the time, people were, really whispering in the dev's ear, nerf this class, because I had a lot of haters on the channel back in the day. And unfortunately, Shadowhunter got nerfed into the ground. And only now, because Gamigo is in charge and actually listens to feedback from players, we've actually gotten the Shadowy Spotlight update, which ended up focusing mainly on reworking the Shadowhunter. Now, that said, do I like the Shadowhunter's ultimate ability now? Not really. It's not my favorite. It's very, very janky and still very broken, similar to how the old Shadowhunter's ult worked. But frankly speaking, what I would have loved to see with the Shadowhunter, and I've talked about this before, would be an arrow barrage, where you would end up toggling your ult and just placing it down on an area similar to the Solarion's #1 ability, I guess, but it would end up being arrows constantly streaming down for a damage over time rather than just repurposing the large arrow. Now, that said, I'm not going to criticize it too much, because obviously what they did with the Shadowhunter is phenomenal. It's a very, very powerful character now and definitely functional for the end game. But I always have my criticisms. It's not like everything's perfect with this game, at least in terms of my opinion. But anyways, that's going to end up doing it for my favorite classes in the game. How did you think that we did? What's your favorite classes? I'd be curious to see it in the comments down below. You can either give me a huge list from front to back, or frankly speaking, just tell me what your top 3, top 5 classes are, or even just your main, whatever, right? And we're going to end up having another video down the line that's going to talk about a lot of classes that I think should be added to the game, because I've talked about it many, many times during live streams that I think I think I've got some pretty good ideas of what classes we should see in Trove, just because I've been playing this game so much, and I kind of want to share those opinions with you guys. So my point is that I don't want you guys commenting of what classes you think should be in the game, because we're going to save that for another video. For today, I want you guys to just mention what your favorite character is and why. Just, I don't know, because it's kind of cool and I like knowing those things. Anyways, I'm going to try and get this video out to you guys as quick as possible, but my God, it was a lot longer than expected. Smash like, sub for more, buy the merch you want, support the channel, and have a wonderful day, everybody.